I'm Pastor Tom, and welcome to the Sunday Sermon.
You got to move, 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 child, you got to move, you got to move, 'cause when the Lord gets ready.
All right, I'm reading a familiar story, John chapter 2, verses 1-11. 3 days later, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there, and Jesus also was invited. And his disciples showed up, and they ran out of wine. And the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Mom, how is this our problem? My hour has not yet come." And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now it happened that there were 6 stone water pots who had set there for the Judean customs of purification, and they contained 20 or 30 gallons each. And Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said, "Draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it to him. And when the master of the feast tasted the water which had become wine, he did not know where it came from. The servants, they knew. And the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then when the guests are a little drunk, they give the poorer stuff. But you have kept the good wine until now." This was the beginning of the signs which Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, manifesting his glory, and his disciples believed in him. All right, let me do historical background stuff first. So a wedding back then, it varies depending if the bride is, if this is her first wedding, so probably big party, it's probably the case. Then she's 13. And the groom could be anywhere from 15, well, probably 15 years old or up. In that day, it was kind of a big deal that the bride was a virgin, and so one of the ways that you ensure this, the law describes, it actually explains this in the Torah, though for some reason everyone seems to get it wrong, that if she has not had a baby and if she is not pregnant at the time of the wedding, and how do you prove she's not pregnant at the time of the wedding? Well, she's just had her period. And so when you read the stories, like Jesus tells some parables about weddings, and when he tells these parables, he's like, "And there was a wedding, and when the appointed day came, they sent the messengers to say, 'Well, today's the day, invited guests, come to the wedding.' So how come the invited guests didn't already know the day of the wedding?" It's because you can't know for sure. It's got to be. It's based on this, on the bride's cycle. And then when they hit okay, now we can have the wedding. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about when it would actually happen as a result. Presumably, this is that kind of a wedding, but it could have been a second wedding, in which case then they can set the date because it's just like bang. They don't have that particular issue that they're concerned about. However, Jesus and Mary have been invited, and Jesus' disciples crashed the party. Okay, so the text doesn't explicitly say that, but the Greek is just a little bit vague. And his disciples also came, and they ran out of wine. So it's like, okay, Jesus got these fishermen with him, and they got a little carried away with the libations. And Mary comes to Jesus and says, they've run out of wine. Like, she clearly thinks it's his problem. And he says, so I gave it the best treatment I could to kind of get across the idiomatic, to get past the idiom and just say what he's saying. He's like, "Mom, how is this my problem?" Basically, is what he's saying. It's not my time yet. Why am I supposed to be the one to fix it? But it actually says, the literal word-for-word translation is, Woman, what is this to you and to me? But what that means is, how is that our problem, or how is that my problem? That's what it means. And we don't actually get Mary's answer in the text, because it jumps from there to her saying to the servants, do whatever he tells you. But I actually know what her answer was. Do whatever he tells you. And I know his answer to her. Yes, Mom. So there's this interesting emphasis on the water pots and the specific emphasis on Judean custom. This again points to an audience that's not Judean. So the two basic theories are a Gentile audience who need to be filled in on some practices, and the other theory is, no, the northerners, what we call Samaritans, whose practices are a little different. Well, the southerners do it this way. So it's hard to say which, but there's this Judean custom where there's a lot of, like, before you wash your hands before you eat, you have to keep kosher, and part of it is the washing, and so there are pots of water on hand for that purpose, and there's the water. And Jesus says, fill them to the brim. Take some to the master of the feast. Okay, so that, you know how in our culture, the best man is responsible for throwing the bachelor party, and the maid of honor or matron of honor, can be either way, is responsible for throwing the bachelorette party? Well, back then, what we might call the best man is probably a friend of the father, so not really related. But there's a guy in there somewhere who's he gets the honored task of running basically running the meal. So it's not a professional caterer; it's a friend who's been given the responsibility, the privilege of being in charge of the food, of all of the eating. Right. So that's who that is. And so there's no good way to translate the word into our terminology. Master of the feast, master of ceremonies. Master of ceremonies is actually a very good way to render it. I sometimes will use the word caterer just because, but there's no accurate equivalent in our culture, but that now you understand what's going on there. John, when he's telling the story, the way he tells the story, he's like, so they took some water, at Jesus' command, they take some water, they bring it to head waiter, and he tastes the water, which has become wine, right? So it's almost like he forgot to tell us that the water gets changed into wine. But I actually think it's just because the people who he's telling the story to are familiar with the story already. You know, when we read it, no one has to tell us the water turned into wine, and Jesus went and turned the water into wine. So as John's writing, it's kind of like almost an afterthought. So they brought some of the water to the head waiter, the water which had been turned into wine, and he had no idea where it came from, though the people who drew it as water knew where it came from. So it's apparently somewhere between the drawing and the drinking, it's been transformed. But that suggests to me that the story is already out there, that it's familiar enough to people that it doesn't require anything like Jesus commanding the water to become wine or waving his hands over it or doing anything like that. He just stands there, and it does the thing. There's this old joke. I appreciate this old joke. Having been Catholic and then Baptist, I really appreciate this old joke. It goes like this. A Catholic priest and a Baptist pastor end up sitting next to each other on an airplane. And obviously, they have some conversation about religion, but there they are sitting on the airplane, and the flight attendant comes along and says to them, "Would you like a drink?" And the priest is like, "Well, what do you got?" He said, "Well, we got some wine, we got some rosé. If you want to pay the upcharge, we can get you a cocktail." And the priest is like, "I'd love an old-fashioned." And, okay. And you, sir, she says to the Baptist. He's like, "None for me, thank you. I'm a pastor." And so she brings the priest his old-fashioned, and he's sipping away. And the Baptist minister is like looking at him like, and finally can't keep quiet. He just bursts out, "How can you, a man of God, a man of the cloth, a pastor, clergy, an example for your flock, how can you drink an alcoholic beverage?" And the priest looks at him and says, "Well, surely you realize Jesus himself turned water into wine." And the pastor looks at him and goes, "Yeah, but I would have thought more highly of him if he hadn't." Jesus produced something between 60 and 90 gallons of wine. And it was the good stuff. But I got to tell you, right, in the Baptist world, that when I was in that world, there was like people arguing about how this stuff wasn't really alcoholic. Which of course belies the whole point of what the guy says to the groom. Like, everyone serves the really good stuff first, and then once everyone's drunk, they bring out the bad stuff. And actually the text says, after they have consumed freely. But, so, yeah. Now, that joke actually points to a thing. It points to an attitude about, it's sometimes called purity living or Puritan living, pietistic living, that's like very strict lifestyle, like no to this, no to that, no to these other things. And that has a long history, not only in our religious traditions, but in every religious tradition. So I have to zip you back into that world of the first century, and I have to tell you that, you have these different pieces going on, right? I've told you about the Sadducees. They're running the temple. So for them, it makes sense. Whatever it is they're doing, they need religion to support their status quo and their privilege because they're rich and powerful and everything's working good for them. So they don't want anything that challenges that at all. The Pharisees, on the other hand, they have a different approach. They're not of the same caste. The priests all come from a priestly caste. We say tribe of Levi, but they're all directly descended from Aaron, Moses' brother. There's a priestly caste that they're a part of. And those who are not in that caste, we like to use the word laity to describe them, and they're just the other ones. And so the rabbis come out of that group. But the rabbis kind of wanted to live priestly lives too. How come I can't live a priestly life? So part of the rabbinic, Pharisaic program, part of what they were doing, and this starts, by the way, for a really important reason, starts actually way back during the Babylonian exile, where they're trying to answer the question, what does it mean to live as people of the God of Israel when there's no temple? How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land is how the psalm asks the question. But that's how it starts. They're trying to answer that question. But then the temple gets rebuilt, and that question now seems to be a little bit like, we don't need to answer that question. We got a temple again. So what they do instead is they begin to do this thing where they're looking at the law, the Torah, where the Torah is talking about laws that apply to the priests in their priestly practice, and they're saying, how can we apply this to our daily lives so we can kind of have priestly lives too? And so they're coming up with all this stuff that Jesus refers to that as the tradition of the elders. But that's what it is. That's what's going on. Then you have the renegade priests who think the priests in Jerusalem are doing it all wrong, and they're over here in the desert. And this is where you have to understand, again, this thing about ritual purity that's so critical in the Bible, and it's not about moral anything. It's ritual, not moral. See, the idea is that it is so dangerous to go into the Holy of Holies that a defect will cause you to burst in flames and explode, or drop dead, or something. And so you have to be like wearing super protective equipment, and there can't be any flaws or defects where the whatever can cause it to burst into flames. Here's how I picture it. If you ever have a magnifying glass, you take a white piece of paper, focus the sun's rays on it, nothing happens. Put a single dot, pen, pencil right there, focus the sun's rays there on that one defect, it'll catch. It'll start to burn. Right? That's how I think about it. If you think about ritual purity that way, what you're doing is you're decontaminating, you're trying to get rid of all this stuff, then you put on special clothing. It has to be, you cannot mix fabrics. That's a very, no thing made of two different kinds of fabric, because that's a defect that will cause it to blow up. I mean, there's stories about guys blowing themselves up because they're messing around with how to worship God. So it's a big deal. Then you put on, the closer you get to the place where you're going to offer that sacrifice, the more purified you need to be. So if you're coming to Jerusalem for a feast day and you're going to offer a sacrifice, starting about just some days before, you are going to begin to practice ritual purity, but only as much as you need. The priests, though, the ones who are going to go in there, they need to be they're baptizing themselves constantly. They've got the special protective clothing, the armor that they wear, the helmet, they go in. And these traditions carry down even long past the time of the Ark of the Covenant, when there is no fiery presence of the divine right there in the center of the Holy of Holies, but that's how they were thinking about it. And now the folks over in the desert, the renegade priests in Qumran, they're like, those guys have got it all wrong. And they have a couple of characteristics to them. One is that they're really strict priests and stuff, and they're going to do this priestly stuff right. We know the correct way to do it, but they're also in what's known as the sort of apocalyptic world. In other words, they are thinking that last days are coming soon. They're no different than the people nowadays who are like, it's the last days. That's the same. They were the same people. They even looked at things in very similar ways. The mindset's identical. And they're like, God's coming anytime now. Who can endure the day of his coming? When God comes into his holy temple, the Lord shall suddenly appear like a refiner's fire. And those other poor guys, they're gone. We got to be ready on a moment's notice to take over. So whereas the Jerusalem priesthood, they rotated, right? So you only had to be strictly ritually pure for a short period of time while you were running the show. But then it was somebody else's turn. But here in Qumran, they're like, we don't know when it's coming. And so they did it all the time. And one of the things this includes is they basically were practicing celibacy, which is weird from a Jewish perspective. But there it was. But from a different perspective, not Jewish. I'm using that word in the religious sense now, in the very strictly religious sense. But in the Greco-Roman world, there's this idea bouncing around that you're really a spirit, and the body that you're stuck in is just what's holding you for a while, and it's kind of icky. So, if you want to survive, you want to be liberated, you want to go to heaven, your spirit to be free, you've got to clamp down on that body. And the idea of living a life that is filled with ascetic practices, not eating certain foods, very, very strict, very all of these things. You got to wear clothing that's uncomfortable. You gotta no happiness, no joy in your life. I gotta keep my body under control. No intimate relationships. No, even people who are married, they've got to, nope, we're just gonna have a spiritual marriage. That idea is out there and it's floating around. And in the New Testament, it's being addressed back and forth. And Jesus is in the middle of this in the year, 30 or so. And these conversations are out there. And he even talks about this in his own way. He's talking about John the Baptist came and he was the strict ascetic, and yet you guys hated him. Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and you guys are ignoring me too. Yeah, nothing will make you happy. But here in this story, there's nothing in the Bible that suggests that a life of self-denial is wrong, especially as a spiritual tool to help you grow. Nothing in the Bible at all. The Bible even recommends periods of self-denial for those purposes, for spiritual growth. And Jesus models that 40 days in the wilderness. But living your whole life that way? If Jesus thought that, what was he doing at a wedding? What was he doing celebrating family, celebrating community, making 70 gallons of really good wine, right? What was that about? This story has so many, there's a lot of symbols in here, like, it's the water is the dead ritual of just going through the religious motions versus a living faith that's alive. It's easy to gets transformed by Jesus, or the water of mere human physical birth, and the transformation into the wine points to our spiritual birth that Jesus is in the next chapter, or setting aside the old ways, and there's a new way of joy coming, all these great things to interpret. But how about this? In a world that's arguing about how much you need to deny yourself to be faithful to God, Jesus is at a party celebrating life, celebrating blessing, celebrating the very thing that came up when we were looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, where the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying, enjoy your life with your spouse. And whatever God gives you to do it with all your might. This is a gift of God. There is Jesus going, this is a gift. Even when his mom's like, you need to solve this problem because it's your boys who drank too much. He says, not only will I solve the problem, but I'm going to solve it on a level no one's ever seen before. It's going to be way better than just I ran to the drugstore and got a couple of 24 packs. This is the good stuff, really good, because when it comes to the joy of life and the gift of God and the blessings of thanksgiving and living in the midst of all of these gracious things God has given to us, there's no diet wine, right? There's only the best. The lives we live, the family, the joy, all of those things that we get, it's these incredible gifts of God, and there's Jesus in the middle of it, affirming it all. And we will have our arguments about, leaving the dead ritual and turning to the whatevers and all that kind of stuff, but at the heart of it, it's really simple. Embrace the life God has given us. Say thank you for the gifts we have, and rejoice and understand that just as Jesus was a guest at that wedding, so Jesus is the guest in our lives as well, rejoicing with us in all of it, blessing us in all of it. Can you find the prayer of response? And please stand as we pray together. Lord God, bring me from dead ritual and routine to vitality of life in your presence. Transform the water which serves only to cleanse the outside into the wine of joy and abundance. Make me able to celebrate the blessings of life and to embrace fully the gift you have given. And let me be like Jesus, who lived for the joy set before him. In his name, amen. We'd love to have you join us for in-person worship Sunday morning at 8:30 at Christ United Methodist, or Sunday morning at 10:15 at Stanton United Methodist. And if Sunday morning is not your jam, join us Monday night, 6 o'clock at Christ United Methodist for Pizza Church. It's church, and then we eat pizza. Until next time, may the Lord God bless you and keep you. May the face of the Almighty be upon you, and may God grant you peace.
Perfect peace. Oh, may God keep you in perfect peace.